Hello, my name is Nally Prather, and I am presenting The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. I chose this story because I found it very interesting about how first-person narrative can change the perspective of an object. Summary. So I split the summary into 3 parts consisting of characters, setting, and my favorite, the wallpaper saga. We have 2 main characters, the narrator and her husband, John. They never gave the name of our dear narrator, but we do seem to find out is that she's a young, high society wife of a doctor, and she appears to have some sort of psychological illness that her husband claims to be depression. So, from the first quote, personally, I believe that the congenial work with excitement and change would do me good. She doesn't exactly agree with her husband's idea of isolation, but she accepts it because he's a doctor and so is her brother. It's partway through the story, though, that she says, I thought it was a good time to talk, so I told him that I really was not gaining here and that I wished he would take me away. She slowly is losing her patience through the story. The final quote I picked for this example is, Why, there is John at the door. It's no use, young man, you cannot open it. How can he call and pound? Now he's crying for an axe. So it's from the final journal entry, and she's tearing the wallpaper off the walls and has lost her mind. So based on the 3 examples, we can see that she's what I would call a dynamic character because she is definitely going through some major mental changes. John is her husband, who she trusts and loves oh so dearly. In the first journal entry, she describes him as practical in the extreme. He has no patience with faith, an intense horror of superstition, and he scoffs openly at any talk of things, ghosts in this case, not to be felt and seen and put down in figures. And then she adds on a couple lines down, he is very careful and loving, hardly lets me stir without special direction. So it's pretty clear to see that she's very attentive of her husband and trusts him wholeheartedly and thinks the world of him. At first he meant to repaper the room, but afterwards he said that I was letting it get the better of me, and that nothing was worse for a nervous patient than to give way to such fancies. So his method of treating mental issues is not exactly given to their wants, and furthermore, he treats his wife as a patient. To drive home the clear point of his tactic home, he says, no one but myself can help me out of it, and that I must use my will and self-control and not let any silly fancies run away with me. Personally, this seems like an ineffective method, and we'll see later on just how ineffective it is. John is considered very flat in comparison to the narrator. He's hardly actually appears and is the same throughout. Setting! Yay! This story was written in June 1890, and we only assume from the lack of information how they talked at the set in that time. And that explains the relationship between her and her husband of how she automatically trusts what he says or at least agrees with it. This entire story is written around the series of journal entries by the narrator. And so when we look at the actual setting, the author kind of foreshadows bad things to come when our narrator describes the mansion/setting as a colonial mansion, a hereditary estate. I would say a haunted house and reach the height of romantic felicity, but that would be asking too much of fate. She's showing that there's a bad vibe coming from this place and that she can see, but her husband cannot. Alright, we're at the final part of our summary/analysis is the wallpaper saga. The story revolves around the depiction of the wallpaper throughout our narrator's description of it, and so it only seemed fitting for it to be a saga of its own entity. So I made up the term dynamic setting because it seemed much like the narrator, the description of the wallpaper changes throughout the story, and so does the role it plays. She first describes the wallpaper as a pain and paper to look at as if the boys' school had used it. It is stripped off the paper in great patches all around the head of my bed, about as far as I can reach, and in great places around the other side of the room down low. I never saw a worse paper in my life. So it's a horrible, hideous wallpaper. And then she goes on to say, there's a recurrent spot where the paper lolls like a broken neck and two bulbous eyes stare at you upside down. So it goes from hideous yellow to eyes staring at her. She says that she's growing fond of the room because of the wallpaper, so her opinion of the wallpaper begins to change. In the third entry, she writes, looked at it in one way, each breath stands alone, the blood curves and flourishes, a kind of debased Romanesque with delirium tremens, go waddling up and down in isolation columns of fatuity. Well, here, delirium tremens is confusion caused by alcohol withdrawal, and fatuity is something foolish. So in other words, it has a lot of twists and turns that doesn't necessarily make sense, but to her it's kind of in a pretty way. And then she writes, and it's like a woman stooping down and creeping about behind the pattern. I don't like it a bit. I wonder, I begin to think, I wish John would take me away from here. So here this is the first mention of the woman, and the woman we can only assume is in fact herself. In the fifth entry, she starts to become paranoid about her caretaker and her husband trying to find the woman before she does, because she sees them inspecting the wallpaper. In the sixth entry, she states that she's getting better, but it's only because of the wallpaper and is afraid of being taken away from the wallpaper. Now all she can think about is the wallpaper. It invokes her senses. And she writes, and she is all the time trying to climb through, but no way could climb through the pattern. It is strangled so. I think it is why it has so many heads. I believe this is where we finally realize that this is actually, in fact, her depiction of herself, and she's being strangled by, well, her husband, society, isolation, anxiety, etc., etc., etc. I see her on that long, shaded lane, creeping up and down. I see her in those dark grape arbors, creeping all around the garden. She has mentioned that she wants to see the garden and she longs to go outside. Even though she isn't supposed to, this is why the woman only creeps about instead of anything else. She's embarrassed to be caught. And then she actually peels off the wallpaper, and I think this is like her breaking free because she's trying desperately to free the woman. Okay, so what does this really mean? Well, she mentions in her very first journal that the reason she doesn't get better is perhaps because of John and not because of depression. And then later mentions she can't handle her own child. And she kind of shows this by, John's a physician, and perhaps I would not say it to a living soul, of course. This is a dead paper and relief of my mind. Perhaps this is the reason why I do not get well faster. And then in the fourth entry, she writes, I never thought before, but it's lucky that John kept me here after all. I can stand it so much easier than a baby, you see. But the ultimate testament is the woman in the wallpaper. She's in fact the woman in the wallpaper trying to escape the shrieking heads. And in this case, the shrieking heads could be, say, society, her husband, the baby, all the things that I kind of mentioned before. So this is, in conclusion, trying to point out that domestic life of women at this time period is, well, a horror story, and possibly trying to change the view of women on what it means to be a domestic housewife. Thank you for watching and listening to my presentation. I hope you either learned something new or gained some clarity on the yellow wallpaper.